All right, welcome back. So let's get into the actual stages of change. There's 6 stages of change. The first one is the status quo. Now, basically, what status quo means is that your client is not even thinking about change. As far as they're concerned, the status quo is just fine. Nothing really needs to change. They don't have a problem. Everything's good. Um, there's no need for change. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why would somebody who's in that phase of change, which doesn't even sound like a phase of change, it sounds like they're not thinking about change at all, and they're not. Why would we call that a phase of change? And why would they even be talking to you as a coach? Well, the answer is probably extrinsic motivation. Somebody has either threatened them that if they don't try and make a change, that there's going to be some kind of negative consequence, or they've been promised some kind of a reward for going and talking to somebody about some area of difficulty or challenge in their life. But intrinsically, they don't want to be there. They don't see the need to be there. They might think it's a waste of time. They might come and, kind of sit there with their arms crossed and just give you, short answers. They might come out and tell you, hey, I don't even want to be here, but my spouse has asked me to be here, or my boss has told me to be here. Sometimes they might have a court order that's telling them to be there. We have one of our coaches here at the Forward Foundation does a lot of work with single parents. And sometimes when single parents get in trouble and wind up in front of a judge, she has a relationship with a judge who sends them to her for some single parent coaching. And so they may not want to be there, but they have to be there in order to appease the judge and avoid some more serious consequences. So you're going to come across situations like that. We have another pair of coaches here at the Forward Foundation likes to work with couples. And it's not uncommon for one person in the marriage or the couple to want to do some kind of a change, make some kind of a change in the relationship, and the other member of the couple doesn't see the need for change or thinks they can do it on their own, that they don't need a coach. So one's motivated and the other one isn't. So you're going to come across this. And the reason that we call it a phase of change is you got to start somewhere. And there is a way with motivational interviewing that you can move them from not thinking they need a change at all to at least considering change. And that's the second step that we'll talk about in the next video is considering change. And it's important to note that moving from one phase of change to the next is a victory. You don't have to move them from step 1 all the way to step 6. It's rarely happens. I've actually never seen it happen. Now, people may come at different phases of change to coaching. They might come at maybe considering change. I don't know if I need to change. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't know. I'm still thinking about it. Some come all the way in the action phase where they're already making a change and they just want some additional help. But they're going to be somewhere in the phases of change, and your job is just to move them one phase of change at a time. It is something worth celebrating to see any movement at all with the proper intrinsic motivation to move through that change process. Okay? So we're talking about status quo right now and moving them from status quo to considering change, right? Okay, so how do you do that? Well, I mentioned earlier that you approach somebody in the status quo phase of change differently than you would approach someone, say, in the action phase of change. A general rule of thumb is that the less invested they are in change, the less pressure you want to put on them to change. The more invested they are in changing, the more you can come alongside them in a sort of active, collaborative way to help move them towards change. So when somebody's all the way in that first stage of change, status quo, not even thinking they need to change, your attitude needs to be like, hey, you don't need to be here. If you don't want to change, that's okay. No one's going to force you to change. I'm certainly not going to force you to change. I usually tell people, like, look, since you're here, why don't we just talk a little bit about this issue and just check and see if there's any reason at all to change. And a little trick that comes from the motivational interviewing material, if you're taking this for accreditation, then you'll have to purchase and read the motivational interviewing book. But there's a little trick in there that they use. I think it's a great trick. It works really well. It's not a trick, but just a way to help people see the issue from a different perspective, is asking them, okay, scale of 1 to 10, how important would you say that it is for you to change? And let's say that they're, not motivated at all, and so they say, maybe like a 2, okay? So then the next question is, why a 2 and not a 1? Now, when you ask that question, they have to justify the higher score. So they'll say things like, well, let's say the change is to stop drinking alcohol. So they might say, well, I do spend a lot of money on it. Occasionally I don't feel good in the morning. Sometimes I stay up too late. Now, what is that? They're giving you reasons why changing might be a good idea. In the motivational interviewing material, they call this eliciting change talk. You're getting the client by asking open-ended questions, and using this scaling technique. You're asking them to make an argument for change. Okay, if you said, why a 2 and not a 5, say, well, then they're going to start justifying the lower score. That's called sustained talk. In other words, they're making an argument to sustain their current way of thinking, their current way of acting. You don't want that. You want change talk, okay? So you say, why a 2 and not a 1, or why a 2 and not a 0, and let them make an argument for change, okay? So that's something that's really helpful. Now, if you can get them to do enough change talk, it might move them to the next phase of change, which, as I mentioned, is considering change. And we will talk about that in the next video. But I just want to note that on page 55, I describe of the large book, I describe the status quo change, and then there's a section that says how to help, and I give you some tips that you can use to kind of guide your way of talking to the client who is in this phase of change. It is also worth mentioning that when you first meet with a client, and remember, if you remember the workflow from Appendix 1, the things that you do in the first meeting, second meeting, third meeting, etc., even when that first meeting, you can be assessing what stage of change are they in. Are you hearing them being intrinsically motivated to change or not? And so it's always a good idea, just like we always want to we always want to do the person-centered coaching traits of unconditional positive regard, building trust, building rapport, being congruent, showing empathy. We're doing that in every meeting, and we're using proper IV in every meeting. And in every meeting, you're wanting to assess what stage of change or phase of change that your client is in, so that you know how to come alongside them, how hard to push, or how much you need to back off and try and elicit more change talk from them to get some movement on that change process. Okay, so in the next video, we will talk about the client who has begun considering change and how to come alongside them, and I will see you there.